Chapter 6, Vulnerability. Crossing into Mississippi was one of the proudest days of my life. That marked my first 500 miles and my second state line crossing. Oddly enough, I think I felt more pride that day than on the last day of my walk. I snapped a self-timed photo with the welcome sign, which I absolutely love to this day. I had spent so much time listening to people telling me how I, quote unquote, had a long ways to go, and this first official feeling checkpoint was the first moment where I felt a deep confidence that I was going to be able to see this through. Walking into Meridian, Mississippi, the atmosphere completely changed from Alabama. People started waving at me out of their cars. An older gentleman drove by a couple of times to check on me, and a couple paid for my lunch. I was loving this town, and having made the progress that I did, I decided to take another 0 day. I snagged a motel room for a ridiculously good deal and settled in for the next couple of days. Not too far away was a Chinese buffet. These became a staple, and it was an incredible experience every time I went to one. Being as hungry as I was from burning so many calories, it helped me to be able to pile up my plate with anything I wanted. At this point, my mood had taken a full 180 after making it out of Alabama. While any cross-country trekker could agree that Mississippi doesn't have the best roads, they were beautiful nonetheless. One of my favorite parts of the walk was walking through a closed-off section of Highway 80. It was closed to traffic due to a small bridge being out. However, it was easily crossable on foot, and I was quite surprised by how many miles of highway I had all to myself. Tall trees hovered across the road, casting shade the entire way, protecting me from the scorching sun that constantly posed a threat despite my umbrella. I was a little over 3 weeks into my walk, and I was at such a high point in the experience. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. For once, I felt like I wasn't questioning the spot that I was in. The deeper meaning of the trip was beginning to reveal itself to me. To some others, the walk meant nothing, but to me, it meant everything. I was actively proving to myself that I was capable of following through with what I said I would. Around this point in the walk, my love of sweet tea started, and I was drinking it every day. I was walking through the South, after all, and trying every kind that I could. I passed through a small town after the stretch of empty highway, where a woman was able to lure me into a building with the promise of sweet tea. She runs an organization that preaches to the homeless while also offering basic necessities. I explained what I was doing, so she knew that I wasn't homeless, but I never got the chance to tell her whether or not I was religious. I suspect that she decided that for herself, as she preached to me for quite some time. 20 or 30 minutes later, I left the building with a very large copy of a King James Bible, a refilled cup of sweet tea, and a warning that I no longer had an excuse to not repent. It was an odd experience for sure, but the trip wouldn't have been what it was without a few of these curveballs. The next day, I had another odd situation thrown at me. Mississippi was overall a great state in my book. I guess I just had a couple of weird days. I was walking through the town of Forest, Mississippi, when a police officer pulled up beside me. He was clearly upset and started explaining that I was a danger to traffic. I was as far over in the shoulder as I possibly could be, but regardless, cars would tend to sway a bit into the opposite lane to put more room between us. I found that no matter how wide the shoulder was, cars would often do this. I do the same thing when I'm driving and there's either a pedestrian or a cyclist on the side of the road. The officer explained to me as he sat parked in the middle of traffic, causing cars to have to go into the opposite lane to get around. He eventually pulled off the road and had me cross over to talk to him. He was thoroughly confused when I told him what I was doing. Well, if you're not homeless, then why the hell would you do something like this? Fair point, I guess. He asked where I was going to stay for the night, and I let him know, and he said I couldn't stay there. According to him, that campground was closed. The gates were closed, and they, quote-unquote, don't allow camping in the summer. That last one seemed a little odd to me. Isn't that when everyone camps? He suggested I camp at a state park up the road, an extra 15 miles or so. I was about burnt out for the day already, having already walked nearly 30 miles. Then he asked to run my ID. He was in his car for several minutes before coming up to me, and with the most skepticism I've ever heard in someone's voice, asked if I was a doctor. Unfortunately, no, I'm not. I graduated with a liberal arts degree. Confused, I asked him to double-check the address that he typed in. I was assured that the address was an exact match, and their system came up with the resident living there as Dr. Andrew Kivett. Has a nice ring, doesn't it? Anyway, this definitely didn't help my case. This dude already thought I was lying about who I was and what I was doing, and now I supposedly had a doctorate at the age of 21. Since I wasn't doing anything wrong in the first place, he didn't have a reason to keep me around. I was able to keep walking and went straight towards the campsite that the officer told me was closed. When I showed up, the gates were wide open. I checked the website, which said it was open, so I paid my camping fees and set up my tent. I also went ahead and called the local police department to let them know where I was and what I was doing, and requested that the officer who had stopped me earlier not bother me anymore. Whoever I talked to at the department was great, and I was assured a safe night of camping. It's ridiculous that I felt like I needed to make that call in the first place. I wasn't breaking any laws, and the campground was definitely open. Unfortunately, negative interactions with the police weren't an uncommon occurrence at all throughout the walk. It's worth noting at this point that I do feel hesitation when writing about the more negative experiences that I had with other people. A lot of the stories I've heard from other cross-country walkers feature such a spotlight on the generosity of others, and there's a lot of that out there that you would experience walking across the country, just as I did too. I will say that my experience felt a little different from some of the others that I've heard, and that I felt I had a fair share of negative interactions with others. Positive interactions far outweighed them, but still, it made me wonder if I was approaching the walk or others with the wrong attitude. This day in particular, I felt extremely vulnerable. Vulnerability was a common theme of the entire walk, a necessary means of getting through to the end. It was this day's encounter that made me realize how much of my identity was currently wrapped up in the walk. Oftentimes, it's so easy to define yourself by what you do for work, who you associate with, your hobbies, and status. For one of the first times in my life, I was in a situation where I didn't really feel like I had any of these things to fall on. There were times I was rejected from certain establishments or talked to in a way that made me wish I could have pulled up in my car with nice clothes and a fresh haircut. While I was walking, others seldom asked anything about me other than aspects of the walk itself. To most that I met, I wasn't much more than a guy walking across the country. It gave me time to reflect on how I perceived myself without much influence from other people. I'm still not sure if I understand what lesson came out of all of that, but I still see it as an important experience nevertheless. The next day was one that I had been looking forward to. Mark Dudek had gotten me in touch with a woman named Cindy in Brandon, Mississippi. She's hosted a myriad of travelers, including Dudek the previous year. She and I had been in touch for a few days, and she had welcomed me to stay at her place anytime I got to the area. When I got into town, her husband picked me up in a parking lot and took me to their place, since it was a few miles north of Highway 80, and Cindy had concerns about me walking on the road that led to their house. Upon arriving, I was able to take a much-needed shower and start helping cook dinner. Cindy is known for her homemade pizzas. She says it's her secret crust recipe that makes them so great. It was, in fact, a great pizza, and we delivered an extra one to some of her family. Cindy's been riding motorcycles since she was in high school, so I couldn't pass up on the opportunity to take a ride on hers to deliver the pizza. One of the best parts of staying with Cindy was all of the stories that she had to tell. She certainly had an eventful life and takes everything with such a creative approach. You could tell this even just by the way she went about renovating her home. When I went to take a shower, I had to go through a secret bookcase door to get to the bathroom. Her kitchen floor was made up of a few thousand pennies. Cindy showed me a whole slew of DIY projects, a main project being homemade bird feeders that she sells. Her craftiness really came in handy when she took a look at the sign on my cart, insisting that it wasn't large or eye-catching enough. Towards the beginning of the walk, I had created a sign for my stroller stating that I was walking across the country. I figured it would mitigate confusion about what I was doing, but a lot of the people that drove by couldn't see the sign. We started discussing it and concluded that there was a big possibility that my sign's lack of readability was contributing to some of my more negative interactions. She offered to create a new sign for me, and I gladly accepted. I needed to head to bed at that point due to my sleep schedule that followed the sunrise and sunset, but being a night owl, she headed out to Walmart and got to work on the sign while I slept. Using gray vinyl, adhesive lettering, and spray paint, she created a large, bold sign. In red, white, and blue, it clearly read, "Walk Across America." The next morning, I slept in a little bit and stuck around for an hour or so to have breakfast and chat with Cindy and Clyde. From their house, I walked through Jackson, Mississippi, and then to Vicksburg, Mississippi. Jackson wasn't the experience I thought it would be. I was excited to see the downtown area, but instead I ended up walking through the outskirts of the town. The bullet casings littered across the sidewalks were a little bit concerning, but I got through the city relatively quickly and with no issues. I actually got to Vicksburg and stayed at a rundown motel just a few miles from the Mississippi River. I was nervous about this part because I had no set-in-stone plan for crossing the river. The issue was that both bridges across the river from Vicksburg were illegal to walk on. In fact, unbeknownst to me, one of the bridges was completely shut down at the time. I had to trust my ability to create a solution to every problem that arose along the way, and this was no exception. The next morning, I headed out early to give myself plenty of time to figure out how to get across. Vicksburg was such a neat town to walk through. It's filled with history, especially surrounding the Civil War. When I made it to Vicksburg Bridge, I started looking around. I had originally thought I might try and offer someone a few bucks to give me a ride across, but I decided to look up taxi services in the area first, and I'm glad I did. I got in touch with a man named David, who said he could meet me by the bridge in just a few minutes. He helped me load up my stroller into his car and agreed to take me to the other side of the bridge. While we were driving across the bridge, he asked me a question. So you've met a lot of people along the way. Have you had mostly positive or negative experiences with them? Although there wasn't much time, I did my best to share a condensed version of a few of the incredible people I had met so far. David seemed really inspired by this. In fact, once we made it to the other side of the bridge and had unloaded all of my gear, he told me not to worry about paying him. It was an extremely kind gesture, but I insisted on compensating him for the service, assuring him that I had more money than I appeared like I did. David was such a highlight of the journey. I'm so happy to have met him, and I love that we got to share that experience. We snagged a couple of pictures, he signed my hat, and then was on his way again. I had just made it to my fourth state, Louisiana. Louisiana was a rough start, and I feared it would be another state that I wouldn't enjoy quite as much. Although the first couple of days weren't my favorite, Louisiana ended up being alright. One of the reasons for this was Joey, another person that kindly welcomed me into their home for a night. Joey picked me up in West Monroe, Louisiana, then took me to his house out in the country. There, I was able to meet his family, enjoy dinner, clean up, and have an air-conditioned room to sleep in. We would end up keeping in touch for the rest of the trip. Joey had so much helpful advice to give and was always incredibly encouraging. Joey served in the Army and has a lot of backpacking experience, which left me with plenty of useful information to fall back on. Joey's greatest contribution to my journey was his ability to inspire and motivate. He consistently commented on my Instagram posts, leaving words of encouragement and checking in on me. After a night relaxing and meeting Joey's family, it was time for me to continue walking. Joey drove me back into town to buy me breakfast and drop me off exactly where he had originally picked me up. Before driving off, he thanked me for allowing him to be a part of my journey, and that through signing my hat, he felt like he was coming along the rest of the way with me. That statement changed how I viewed my interactions for the rest of the trip. While much of Louisiana turned out just fine, my worst motel experience of the entire 98 days was in Minden, Louisiana. My body was burnt out at that point, not having had many days off, so I decided I would grab a motel for a couple of nights. The first motel I came across wasn't accepting any new guests, so I walked to the next one. It was trashed. If it weren't for the faint, glowing vacancy sign, I would have thought the place had been shut down. I should have used my better judgment and turned around right away, but I decided to give it a chance, as it was my only option. Walking into my room was a shock. I had been in some bad motel rooms before, but this one definitely took the cake. The walls were stained, the sheets were littered with burn marks and blood stains, and to top it all off, I discovered bed bugs later in the evening. Bed bugs were a problem that I simply couldn't afford to deal with. Although it was 10 p.m. when I discovered them, I made the difficult decision to leave the motel and keep walking. Night walking was not something I had done much of at all, due to drivers' lack of visibility. I avoided it as much as possible and only ended up doing it a few nights out of the 98. I was on the highway for about 2.5 hours with no clear spot to camp in sight. I was starting to get nervous, as I knew I would look suspicious being out at that time and attract more attention than I normally might during the day with my headlamp. I saw a cop car drive by, then began to slow down. Ah, shit, I thought, especially after the last police encounter I'd just had. I saw his lights flip on and knew it was very possible I'd be in for some trouble. Thankfully, Sergeant Kobe Barton pulled up and simply asked if I was okay. I was surprised, especially after so often being greeted with the question of what I was doing and if I had my ID on me. Barton was excited about what I was doing and was more than willing to help out. As if a light bulb had gone off in his head, he mentioned a truck stop not too far down the road. In fact, he knew the owner. He told me to keep walking and that he'd be right back. A few minutes later, he pulled back up, not only with permission for me to spend the night at that gas station, but also a couple of drinks and snacks that he brought for me. After having some upsetting interactions with law enforcement in the days prior, this was just what I needed to get my spirits up. By this point, I was most of the way through Louisiana, and thankfully I was, because a nearby tropical storm was causing pretty nasty weather to start brewing. I remember one particular day just outside of Shreveport, I noticed weather beginning to come in. I started going from motel to motel trying to find an open room. For whatever reason, most of them were all booked up. It's very possible it was from others in South Louisiana trying to escape the hurricane threat. I managed to snag one last room just in time. In fact, it started pouring rain literally as soon as I walked into the lobby. That was by far one of the weirdest motel rooms I've ever stayed in. It was simply incomplete. There was a TV wall mount, but no TV. No microwave or fridge, most of the light bulbs were missing, the dresser was missing a drawer, and the bathroom door had a massive hole in it. It was really weird, but I was more than grateful to be dry for the night. I was able to cross the Texas state line the next morning. I felt an instant change that day. The weather felt as if it had changed for the better overnight, and the quality of the roads greatly improved. I didn't know it yet, but Texas was going to be one of my best state crossing experiences. I was almost immediately welcomed by a man named Delgado. He offered a ride, which I turned down, along with an array of items in his truck. A large hat, raincoat, rope, water, you name it. Honestly, some of it really could have come in handy, I'm sure, but my stroller was starting to get pretty weighed down. On top of that, I had just blown one of my tires, making it a little bit more difficult to push than usual. Regardless, I managed to make quick time, arriving at the next town 34 miles away mid-afternoon, leaving plenty of time to relax, go out to eat, and stock up on some more food. Around this time, I was beginning to regularly walk higher mile days, hitting at least 30 miles most days, as opposed to the 20-something mile days I was regularly walking in the first weeks. This changed the dynamic of the trip in a few ways, the obvious being that I could complete the walk quicker. It also ensured that I'd be able to get to motels more often and spend less time in between towns. While in Texas, I had one of the most generous experiences of the walk while staying at a motel, where I met Perul while she was running the front desk. The morning that I checked out of the hotel, I was handing her my key card. She also reached out with a wad of cash. "For your journey," she exclaimed. Within the stack of 20s, I found a single $1 bill. Perul explained that in her culture, the extra $1 is a symbol of good luck. I promised her that I would take that dollar with me all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and I did follow through with that. Texas was the first state where I began to experience issues with dogs. Now don't get me wrong, I absolutely love dogs. In the South, however, it's not uncommon to come across aggressive, unfenced, or unleashed dogs roaming freely. In my case, all of these were right next to the busy highways I was walking on. It was frustrating in terms of my safety, as well as for the dogs. I saw quite a few deceased dogs on the side of the road, and watched one almost get hit by a car as it ran out towards me. On one particular morning, a group of 3 or 4 dogs ran off their property and surrounded me. One was especially upset and wouldn't stop following me, even as I tried to ignore it and create as much distance from its owner's property as possible. Even several hundred feet away from the yard, the dog darted at me, biting me right behind my knee. Upset and panicked, I yelled at one of the owners, who was standing in silence on his porch staring. "Come get your fucking dog off me." He walked over, which distracted the dogs enough for me to get away. I didn't think that the dog had bitten me that hard, but upon feeling the area, I discovered blood. This wasn't good. The bite had broken skin, and I knew nothing about the vaccination status of the dog. I wasn't about to go back to that property to find out either. After a few phone calls and the discovery that there wasn't an animal control in that town anymore, I decided to take the risk and hope that I wouldn't contract anything. After all, the logistics of figuring out how to do several rabies shots over the course of 2 weeks just didn't feel very feasible. Not having a current stock of first aid supplies due to my previous injuries, I walked to the nearest Dollar General, got what I needed, then booked a motel room across the street. While I did my best to take care of the bite that afternoon, I'll admit that I did a poor job of tending to my physical health along the way. There were several instances where I was walking around with open wounds in my exposed feet, ignoring pains, and at one point later on the walk, I walked for a week with what I believe was strep. I was making progress very quickly at this point and was already nearing Dallas. Given what I had heard from Dudek about how dangerous it was for a pedestrian to walk on Dallas highways, I decided to walk south of Dallas and gradually work my way back north to Arlington. While it wasn't a perfect route, it seemed to be a lot better than the alternative. For much of this stretch, I was going through very suburban areas, usually with sidewalks available. There was one stretch of country road without a shoulder, though, that became very frustrating. On top of that, my left ankle had developed a shooting pain with every step. I was extremely discouraged, especially knowing how many miles I still had left for the day. In what seemed like perfect timing, I heard someone behind. "Hey man, are you doing a walk across America?" That was oddly specific, and I hadn't had anybody ask that yet. Surprised, I turned around to see a man named Brandon offering a hand to shake. Brandon is a pastor and served in the military. He offered to go get whatever food I wanted for lunch, and as bad as I felt, I couldn't turn it down. I'd been craving Panda Express, and I finally had the opportunity to get it. He was back not much later with not only my lunch, but also a variety of snacks and electrolyte mixes to help me stay hydrated. Brandon and I got connected on social media and stayed in touch throughout the remainder of the trip. He had all sorts of advice to share, especially since he spent quite a bit of time in the desert when he was deployed. Seemingly obvious bits of information like hydrate the day before, not the day of, and preparing for the possibility of my stroller breaking down in the middle of nowhere were crucial. Like Joey from Louisiana, Brandon kept up to date with my Instagram and offered support and encouragement throughout the rest of my journey. He even offered to drive out and bring me shoes and other supplies if I were to need them. Not more than a couple hours later, a woman pulled off the road to say hi, as she had seen Brandon's posts about me on Instagram. I believe they had known each other in high school. It's a small world. Here I was in the greater Dallas area, probably one of the most populated areas of my walk to date, and I was still able to find great connections like these.